Recording. Welcome everyone to our 13th panel of the Global Family Systems and Psychosocial Resilience Project. Today we are focusing our time together on understanding and implementing the social determinants of health and the response to families' needs during the pandemic. So we're very fortunate to have our panel led by Dr. Dorcas Matowe, who wrote a study on racial and ethnic disparities and marriage and family therapists' understanding of those, and really brought the idea for us, for me, around how to bring in social determinants of health in our discussion of COVID-19 response. We also are lucky to have Dr. Kristina Brown with us. We have Christopher Osbourne-Williams, Dr. Sanja Rolovic, and Shereen Francis. I've posted their bios in the chat, and they can introduce themselves as they wish, where they are and what they're doing. We're so happy to have all of you here to present and talk about your work. Welcome, and I think we can hand the floor over to you, Dorcas.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I will go ahead and share my screen so I can start the PowerPoint. Okay, so welcome everyone. Laurie's already done most of the introduction and what the panel is about. So I will just talk quickly about myself. So I did my dissertation study on assessing marriage and family therapists' understanding and perceptions of racial and ethnic health disparities. And as I was doing that research, I was a minority fellow through SAMHSA AAMFT, and I started to discover just how prevalent the disparities are for racial and ethnic minorities in the US. And because of that study, I came to understand the importance of social determinants of health. And so social determinants of health were established by the World Health Organization to help us understand factors that impact health for communities, for individuals. So our basic outline is to discuss, social determinants of health as they relate to COVID-19, to domestic violence, and to family crises as well. And so here is just a simple explanation of what social determinants of health are. Now, of course, because we're pressed for time, because we have, quite a few panelists, I'm sort of cutting out a lot of information. But a simple way to summarize this is where you live, where you work, your neighborhood, your access to education, the quality of care you receive, all of that impact your overall health. And so as we have seen in the US from the first report that came out on minority health in the 1980s, which is known as the Heckler Report, demonstrated that racial and ethnic minorities are at a disadvantage when it comes to access and quality to care. They have the highest rates when it comes to cancer, and this is almost, all cancers we can talk about. The same goes to HIV/AIDS access and treatment. The same goes to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, asthma for children. So the list goes on and on. In 2019, we are seeing that, COVID-19 has also been added to the list. So this is just a simple way to understand why we need to know what social determinants of health are. And, clearly we can see that the minorities, Blacks, Hispanics in the US are suffering significantly when it comes to not just COVID-19, but the other health concerns that I already mentioned. So this is one of the stats I came across on the US COVID-19 death rates. As we can see, Black people are dying at 2.4 times the rate of white people. Hispanics, Latinos, American Indian, Alaska Natives are also at the top of this list as well. So this is a report that came out in the Washington Post in September of last year, which also indicated that coronavirus has killed far more Hispanic and Black children than white youths. And so as we're starting to see information coming out as well about access to the vaccine, we are seeing that, again, minorities are falling short on this list as well. So these are concerning issues for us, and trying to understand why, the best way to do that is to examine the social determinants of health. So this is just my summary. I will talk more about it as the presentation goes along. I want to make sure that all the other panelists have time to share what they're doing in their work. So I will say more about this as we begin the discussion. So we can move on to Kristina's presentation. And let me...
Thank you so much. And thank you really for setting such a strong foundation for, the information we'll be sharing today. So my name is Kristina Brown, and I'm the chair of the Couple and Family Therapy Department at Adler University in Chicago. And I had the pleasure of actually getting to know and meeting Laurie through talking about Fulbright. I'm also currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Feminist Family Therapy, and I'm also working with LMFT as the editor of a new systemic ethics textbook that we're hopefully going to be having out in the fall. I have really leaned into my identity as a feminist researcher, and one of my specific areas of interest is looking at gender in different areas, medical family therapy, women's experiences. And as the pandemic was sort of shutting down institutions, we were all experiencing quarantine, social distancing, there started to become a number of research more narrative, non-empirical articles, as well as different reports across academia that there was a reduction in academic productivity by women and women-identified scholars. And so, in response to that, I had the wonderful opportunity to come together with colleagues and women academics across disciplines across the U.S., multilingual, multicultural, multidiscipline, and we started to investigate, looking at what were some of the obstacles. Sorry, this is my cat. What are some of the obstacles that were in place that were keeping women from producing scholarship during COVID-19? And so in our first phase of research, we provided an open-ended survey to our fellow academic women in the social group that we came together, which allowed us to look specifically at women's experiences and how they were managing the impact of the pandemic. And we can actually slip to the next slide. And so within our group of 16 researchers, we took a look at, what were some of the things, the before and after, how things were different for routines for women at home, how they were being supported by their universities, how this was impacting their relationships with their primary partner, how this was impacting their ability if they identified as a parent. And from our data of research, we had a little bit over 100 responses, and we did open-ended survey questions because we realized we didn't want to put an additional burden on any of our participants. So many of them were carrying multiple roles across their professional and personal identities. And so we did an open-ended survey, but we did qualitative work in that we analyzed the different responses. Within our larger group of 16 women, we came into different subgroups looking at different identities. And I had the pleasure of joining 3 colleagues, and we looked specifically at academic women who identified as partners and academic women who identified identified as parents. And one of the things that we found is that many of the long-standing biases, the racial biases, the gender biases within academia were only being heightened and magnified through the pandemic. And so we took a look at, of those just over 100 responses, 67 of those academic women identified as partners. And they really talked specifically about how the pandemic was causing problems with literal time and space, time and sense of how they were balancing the different requirements from their job, how they were then in the home full time, and then sharing literal space with a partner or with children, and not having the space within their home to attend to the different needs. They also talked about communication struggles with their partner, being able to articulate, what was specifically going on for them, what their needs were, as well as then in the needs, one of the opportunities is they talked about that their partner was able to learn a little bit more about, what they did every day as an academic and what that looked like. And I shared a couple quotes that we had directly from our participants. One said that they talked about divorce and moving to another country most days. They thought about divorce. And the second was, I care less about managing his feelings. I take care of myself and my son, and that's all I have the bandwidth for. It was interesting. I know we'll be talking about domestic violence because we've definitely seen reports of increases in domestic violence, but one of the limitations we realized in our first phase study is that we didn't specifically ask about experiences of violence at home. And so some of the things we're looking for, because we're now currently in our second phase, is asking some more specific questions about coping strategies and how things are going on in the home. But we also then further looked at 101 responses and looked at those who identified as parents and talked about the ways in which the pandemic has impacted their ability to manage both academia as well as the household demands. And so many of them talked about the altered childcare needs that, especially right away at the beginning of the pandemic, that many schools shut down, or childcare facilities shut down, or even family members who had been sharing in caretaking responsibilities because of social distancing and quarantine were no longer able to support each other in those contexts. And so we definitely saw that was a big barrier to women attending to their professional needs. And then further exacerbating that was the conflicting demands between both home and work. And many women really speaking to the fact that family came first for them. So we have one participant who said scholarship has honestly taken a back seat during the pandemic. It just didn't seem as important as taking care of myself and my family. We also then connected back to our first look at partners. There were a lot of relational changes between parents and how they negotiated that. And then negative emotions, both on the part of the parent as well as concern for their child's mental health. And so we actually are now in our second phase of study, and we're taking a look across the globe. We had looked sort of in a selective sampling, within a smaller group. And now we've opened up our study across academia, across disciplines, across identities around the globe. And so you'll see the link in the bottom, and I'm happy to share sort of our recruit for continued participants. So that's one of my passions. And then I had actually shared that I'm doing a current study on perinatal mental health, but we don't have any results yet because we're still collecting data. And we're taking a look at the experiences of individuals who've given birth during the pandemic and how the different requirements around safety and health have been impacting their experiences pre-delivery and then during postpartum, as well as we're taking a look at some of the experiences of actual birth. We're doing both, my colleague and I, Dr. Rachel Diamond, who her area of expertise is perinatal mental health, is doing a quantitative study, and with students, I'm doing a qualitative study where we've been interviewing parents within the US about their experiences. So we're eager to see what that's looked like. It's interesting, reflecting back on Dorcas's information that she shared, we're really struggling to get a diverse representation of identities in terms of willingness to share and trust in our process in research and participate. And so we've been doing some definite targeted recruiting, but because of those health disparities for different different racial identities, LGBTQ plus identities, we've really struggled with having a diversity of response. And so, noting that that's definitely been a concern and an issue throughout COVID. So I'm looking forward to those responses, but I'm especially looking forward to hearing from my colleagues and learning from them. So I'll pass on to, I believe that RC is going to go next. Dorcas, I'll turn it back to you.
Yes. Yeah, so Ron, you can take over.
Yeah, so what I want to talk a little bit about, I know that domestic violence is a very, sometimes very heightened topic, but sometimes goes very under the radar of people's comfortable level about sometimes as a domestic violence trainer and prevention person. I tried so much to try to get people to understand, but really understanding now in COVID-19 how much more intense domestic violence is being displayed in our communities. When I'm looking at the communities where I kind of do some of the work, and we're talking about eastern, kind of like two major cities. I would say in South Florida called Broward County, and also some work in Philadelphia proper. Um, we're seeing, really, when we're looking at stuff on the front line, one of the biggest things that we're seeing due to the virus is that people are really being cut off from family members, friends in the community that can support. And that's probably one of the biggest factors. Disabled, not being able to, to attend work, that the opportunity to be able to get out, limited to being in one home, and a lot of times in that home with the abuser. And there aren't other, only the list of COVID-19 safety measures. You have to also begin to now start to look at what how this heightens the how COVID-19 and heightens the abusers in the home. And it's become something that becomes before abusers were able to get away and not be in the home, and there were safeties that you could have. So when you're looking at things really on the front line, you begin to start saying, well, how are people able to go through, and what are they able to do to get out of this? And a lot of times right now, as we see in a lot of the shelters, because of some of the restrictions of social distancing, sometimes people are almost scared to go to a shelter. So they're not knowing where to, you know, what am I doing when am I going to stay here in the place where I have a place to live, or am I going to go to a shelter that may risk me or my children to getting COVID-19 because this might be overpacked? And then also the other aspect of that is the shelters will have to only take the capacity they can take. So at some point, especially I think here in Broward County, the shelter already had a limitation of how many people could come and be in a shelter. They had you had to be at a point of in immediate danger to be able to get into the shelter. So now, even having limited space, now you're looking at an opportunity where they're almost saying, well, let's see what other resources we can find. And we know that a lot of times looking at other resources right now with the offset of COVID-19, a lot of those other resources are inaccessible. So it leaves a lot of people to really be isolated, and really be exposed to the tactics of abuse used by the abuser to the victim. One biggest thing that you see is this economic stress. Even though we know, when we think of a large majority of people who, and we have this idea who are people who may be affected by domestic violence, we can see that by COVID-19, economic stress goes across the board in reference to finance. And mainly hire people who had higher finances before, because we see sometimes people who haven't had, they wasn't living at a certain level. COVID-19 didn't affect them as much if they didn't really have a high-paying job and they didn't lose it. They were working check to check. If they're able to still check to check you don't see the higher stress, whereas you can see in households where they were, they were the main providers or they had high income. Now this stress is adding on to some of their power and control tactics. So this is one of the things we really is looking at. One of the big things that I really wanted to kind of talk about more than anything is just hearing and for us to kind of get a better understanding of some of the things that are really taking place with people right now during COVID-19, and what some decisions that we're finding that big drivers have to make. We have people who are and ask for shelter or just opting for legal protection over trying to live in the shelter, um, who are they're more interested in the shelter, have questions about how to keep their site safe and healthy and clean. So they're not looking so much on going to a shelter, but more of, well, what can I do to keep our shelters clean? And as a scare part, because you're talking about community living. And I think we see that all when we look at homeless populations. When you're living in shelters, these places are not like an individual hotel room where one person gets to stay in a large quality space. We also look at, sometimes you have a lot of survivors looking at the challenge of making a decision of missing work, and the income it provides, or allowing the abuser to watch and take care of children. That's one of the big challenges we're looking at now. Like, what do I do? Do I allow my children to be with abusers so I can work, so I can end up having another place, or try to get out? That becomes another roadblock, and maybe some safety plans that people have. We also usually being able to they can share their abused partner is home when they are making calls. Therefore, they experience more short, frantic calls, more hang-ups, erupted. So what we're getting, a lot of points we're getting from hotlines are that we can't even get information sometimes from the people who are trying to call hotlines because they don't have the privacy to be able to call out. And that is affecting what type of services and what kind of services domestic violence can help right now, because normally, in a typical situation, a survivor would be able to have a time that would be to themselves. But in the COVID based environment we're in now, the abusers are in the house all the time, and that's adding to a lot of what we have. And then you see another issue that is a big concern when we talk about what happens when people come out of COVID, because there's a result after this. We're seeing a lot of callers saying they are being more coerced into having sex as a form of abuse at bay to keep the peace. So we're saying that they're more saying, listen, let me do be coerced to have sex, and that can keep the peace in the house, and we won't have problems. Ultimately, knowing that, one of the big things we always concerned about is sometimes with power control tactics, pregnancy is another means of power and control. So if someone is getting pregnant, then the abuser has more power over the individual or the survivor, I think. And then the last thing we're looking at, and one of the biggest things was being able to how to tell family and friends about abuse, in the hopes that the loved ones will offer a safe place to live, and instead of having to go to live and go to the shelters during COVID-19. And that is sometimes one of the biggest concerns we have, period, before COVID-19. Like, family members want to help, but they're not willing to have family members come and stay, and it become more stressed based on living with family. Then they're saying, how long are you going to live here? And sometimes the surviving victims don't know how long they're going to be able to do whatever they're doing. They're dealing with a very large trauma, that they're even in a state of frantic, even leaving their partner and hoping that that partner doesn't find them or put them back into a dangerous situation. So, all one of the that I really look at is that as much as we have COVID-19, and we say, how has it has affected the overall society? It maybe have did a very dangerous effect on people who are facing domestic violence. They're now put in situations where it is less likely they can put a safety plan together to establish a way to even retreat from these situations. They are now in situations where they're with partners that are highly more stressed, highly more motivated to engage in power and control tactics due to the whatever outside factors that are occurring to them now, and that families are in more danger being in the COVID-19 and not able to get the efficient help that they would have been able to get without COVID-19, not being in COVID-19. So, this is one of the, I can say that I don't know where we're going to be able to go after this, because a lot of domestic, even here we have one major domestic violence center, and with that work being done, a lot of people may even start to feel like, well, there's no hope or no help, and that's a scary position that I begin to see based on the effects of COVID-19 on domestic violence.
All right. Thank you very much, Ron. We will move on to Sanja.
Hello there. Hi, Sanja. Listen, thank you so much for having me. And my name is Sanja Rolovic, and I'm delighted to be here on this panel. Laurie and I go a long way, all the way from the AFTA, American Family Therapy Academy, and that is our connection. And that's the way that I got to be invited to share some of my thoughts and experiences with all of you here. So, and the way that after thinking how I would like to, what I would like to focus on for our conversation and our panel today, the decision that I made is that I want to talk about some of the thoughts and insights that come both from my personal experiences as an immigrant, as well as the conversations that I have been engaged in over this past year with people who, as I did, left their often fraught with political unrest and violence homeland in search of and hopes to find a safer home. And I'll be proposing a few parallels between the experiences the experiences that we here in the United States have been having and living through this past year. Some parallels between experiences that immigrants go, I think, pretty much throughout their whole life, and the experiences that we've been having here in the United States. And the way that I would also like to tie or bring to your attention the connection between these two is the concept of home. The concept of home in times of peril, in ways in which our existential and emotional conceptualizations of home, as well as our relationship to and with home, changes in the life of forces that come from the outside, that are imposed from the larger systems, and especially when those events let loose powerful and aggressive systemic forces of a divide, like racism in this country and nationalism in my part of the world. So, so what I felt during the COVID year, during this past 12 months, is I felt an immigrant alarm. It was time to go home. Everything inside of me was saying it was time to go home. I left Belgrade when it was Yugoslavia, and I have been living in New York City for the past 33 years. I return to my hometown every year. Sometimes I go 2-3 times a year. And although my parents are no longer alive, all my relatives and most of my family is there. But don't misunderstand me. Physically, I am very much here, very much in New York, and often without any desire to be physically there, which is Belgrade. But of course, throughout all these years, I have my ears pricked to hear what goes on there. So I guess like most immigrants, I have been living as if it were a double life. Living between two worlds for the past 33 years, negotiating the restless tension between two places, Belgrade and New York, at times more successfully and other times not as well, just opposing those two worldviews side by side. So I have been in an ongoing conversation with all the continuities and all the discontinuities of the self in relation to others. Big part of my practice is working with people who are immigrants from all over the world. And obviously, I have worked with many, many people coming from my country being former Yugoslavia. It all started with my work at the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture many number of years ago, and it continued through various other ways throughout these past many years. So over the years, I have been privileged to be a part of conversations concerning stories related to how do we make meaning of traumatic experiences. And as of lately, of course, how do we make meaning of this pandemic experience? And one of the experiences that have clearly resurfaced throughout this pandemic, and most importantly, the life that the pandemic has imposed on us, is the awareness of impermanence and the awareness of life's finitude. So what have we been confronted with in this past year? We've been confronted with the loss of pre-crisis ways of life. Our hopes and dreams for the future have been threatened. The loss of a sense of normalcy, loss of jobs, financial security, livelihood. And not even to mention that some of us have experienced the loss of loved ones. Also, what became very, very clear during this past year is the awareness of the connection between the past, which is often tied to the unresolved trauma. Whatever the trauma may be, in this particular year, this was COVID-19. And what we also know very well is that we internalize our histories, and not only our individual histories, but our country's histories. Our country's histories are interwoven in every fabric of our being. And what has become clear is that the history cuts right through, especially the collective history, like a sharp knife, if I may even use that symbolism, that divides and leaves raw pieces of life that need to be reassembled. In my country, nationalism. Here, racism. The pandemic has given us distance from our former lives, a distance as if we were immigrants, migrants in another country. Like immigrants when they first arrived, these days, or this past year, living in the United States has been living, for some of us, in a country that we do not recognize. So what can we learn from immigrants? At a time when social distancing is ruling our days, and the world has changed in previously unimaginable ways, we can learn from people who have started anew in a land they do not recognize. We can learn from them a lot. Immigrants are experts in adjusting to the pain and confusion that distance can create, even while it saves lives. Immigrants already know what it feels to stay away from those we love. Immigrants have come to terms that distress that erodes us when the normal flow of life is missing. Immigrants know loneliness, the kind that consumes those who are now isolated from their communities. Immigrants understand the agony of not being able to confront faraway friends and family who's sick or alone or distraught. Immigrants have been gripped with anguish when funerals go on without our presence, making death even more unbearable. And immigrants have also learned that such trials and tests create opportunities for growth. The helplessness one feels when in a strange land, without family or community networks, can lead to the discovery of one's own resilience. So this pandemic has given us distance from our former lives, a distance that, as if we were migrants to another country, can help us emerge with new eyes to envision a different future. So during these past several months, the months of the pandemic, I realized I had to go home. With New York becoming so unstable, so dark, so destitute, so deserted, Belgrade presented with a possibility of a more solid ground beneath my feet. For me, Belgrade is a place where I do not have to explain myself, a place where I simply am, a place where people, the landscape, the humor, all have shared references. I realized I cannot once again be placed in a situation one I had been years ago, to stay away, to be separate from those I love. I needed to return to the stores, the streets, the smells that embody every single part of my being, and that in some ways, going back in a different relation to my home all these years later, presents something constant and durable. And after all my dead are in my homeland. And with that, and with the dead, are my roots.
All right, thank you so much, Sanja. We will move on to Shereen.
Hello all, good evening. So I'm a humanitarian, I think from birth, from within my mother's uterus. I'd like to believe that. Within the realm of my experiences, I am currently working for an international humanitarian organization that supports local humanitarian organizations within the Southern African region. And over the years, it's not uncommon to understand and see what dire straits, elements of economical strife has caused populations within Southern Africa. So amongst the populations in particular, we work a lot with volunteers, and these are people within communities who basically want to see the community within where they live to be better. And part of what the volunteers tend to do are, for example, school children feeding programs. With the arrival of COVID, what has happened obviously is there's been a lockdown, and that means children have no access to school. And most of the time, for most of these children, the one meal that they receive from these volunteers of these international humanitarian organizations is the only meal that they receive within the day. Going back home, it's phenomenal to realize that because of where their backgrounds, you'd find that they would be one of maybe 3 or 4 or 5, maybe sometimes more children within a family household, and the parents would be struggling. So sending children to school would be an opening for most parents to actually allow for a child to actually receive a meal. Most of the times it's actually a balanced meal. Some of the times the children would receive very basic elements, which then obviously also cause their health to be stunted. If obviously they don't receive the full balances consistently, these volunteers work with the support of donors. And it's, as we know with COVID, a lot of the times most of the funding that most donors would normally give are based more or less on the supply of PPEs and various other elements. So this is like a hidden cause that what we have noticed. The privileges of actually being in the school also, unfortunately, them now being at home would then force parents to do what may seem, I think, from many cultures, very untoward, which is to send their children out into the street to beg for food, and also be part and parcel of their income as well. And that has a contributing detrimental effect on the children, especially for those who come back empty-handed. They may have eaten, because as I'm sure for those of you who may have seen pictures of street children, they would basically be given whatever is in the vehicle of a person passing by, a well-wisher. So be it, the leftover of a banana or a pizza or just a drink, and that is consumed immediately. So coming back home with anything that would be of value to the other children at home is usually close to nothing. That in itself causes obviously many issues, especially from when we look at child abuse, because there is that understanding that the parents are sending out these children who under normal circumstances would have been in school, but now have to become street children, to then commit abuse of these particular children, which is something that we're getting to see quite a lot of. Nonetheless, with the advent of that, we're also getting to see from the experiences that we have seen, the elements of the marginalized, and in particular from the children that we're talking about, we have children who already were in a predicament that was not necessarily in the best of predicaments, which are those that are hard of hearing and hard of sight. So the sight and hearing impediments that they had already experienced is part and parcel of more or less what they tend to have had hardships with facing before, but now have an increased element with the onset of COVID. That being said, what tends to happen is some of the institutions that we support have created, especially from an information dissemination perspective, posters that are in sign language and in Braille, in order to try to at least encourage information to be imparted to the marginalized. That has gone down really well, and this is something that we employ and support. Regrettably, it's not all institutions within Southern Africa that we've seen that have adopted this, but we're encouraging this. Taking note that most governments have actually that is an oversight of most governments and some of the international institutions that are also in a position to support such groups. So going forward, and with the onset of the second wave, and hopefully we do not get a third wave, we're looking forward to seeing that the marginalized groups, and in particular the most vulnerable, which include these children that I'm mentioning, would be included in support and more support from these institutions. Access to medical attention within Southern Africa, we already also had quite a dismal aspect of access to medical facilities, or that had adequate medical support for the marginalized already. And what the volunteers from the humanitarian organizations try to do is bridge the gap. So you find certain pilot little programs where you have volunteers themselves just offering very minor, I would say, first aid support to the communities, and that has helped a lot, but it's not sufficient enough when you start looking at those with chronic illnesses who don't have access to their medication because either they are in lockdown, or especially children with type 1 diabetes, or those even who may also have contracted type 2, but the access to such medication, which is really particularly for those communities, is not necessarily what the humanitarian organizations actually have at hand. They would have the basic issues of paracetamols and over-the-counter prophylaxis. So these are the kind of things that we're getting to see more and more from the humanitarian perspective, that there's a lot of gaps within the support from our institutions that need to be addressed, that may be addressed from a perspective of collective reflection of what has been taking place from the onset of when COVID was actually pronounced, which within Southern Africa, it was roughly about March last year. And then coupled with all of that, and I would say the icing on the cake is the political concerns. And when I say this, we talk about distribution of support by these humanitarian institutions within communities that under normal circumstances, when you're giving things like food, are very welcoming. However, when you put a political aspect into it, and as we speak right now, there's one country that is already going into election campaigning, that puts the vulnerability of these volunteers into question. So some volunteers are actually not going into specific communities because of the safety of their own elements, which then obviously has a detrimental effect on the work that they're doing and the beneficiaries in particular. So ultimately, these humanitarian institutions governed by principles which are neutrality, which include neutrality and impartiality when performing their duties, are in predicaments that for their own safety have to stop within communities that should really have the humanitarian aspect in mind. You are who I am, more or less, and that seems to be very frayed, and that's what we are seeing as we speak right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shereen. So, yep, we are wrapping up. Just want to say thank you to all the panelists. And then for more information, you can definitely go to our website, globalfamilysystems.com. And at this point, I'll pass it on to Gameela, who will get us into the question section of this presentations.
Thank you, Dorcas, and thank you to all of you presented. Well, so summarize. Talked about. So first of all, Dorcas, thank you for really introducing terms, talking about how education, health, environment, social community, context, economic stability have impacts on health. Then we had Kristina Brown, who specifically spoke about women's experience, managed impact of the pandemic. I'm sorry, I don't have enough time, I think, to talk in detail about everything that you said, but I think it was a very interesting presentation, and so thank you very much. Also, RC, who spoke about the relationship between COVID-19 and domestic violence. I think that was really a very important presentation that I think all of you have probably sort of experienced, have had clients who have experienced the impact of DV. Also Sanja, who shared experiences of clients of hers in the US, and we focused on the discussion on the connection of the concept of home, which I think is also very important. Of notions or concepts such as absence of permanency and loss, right? And also you shared a personal account on how we can learn from immigrants who have already dealt with loss and loneliness. I think also extremely interesting. and Shereen from Zimbabwe, who talked about sending children to school and how it helps children get a balance, how it was important a balanced meal. And so that was also something that came out and was of interest to all of us. So now I open the floor to questions, comments, to whoever would be interested.